Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Carnegie Council webinar, which is going to look at an important question that has been hovering at the margins of the election campaign for 2020. I'm Nick Gvosdev. I'm a senior fellow. I'm wearing my senior fellow at the Carnegie Council hat for this event today, and I'd like to welcome you to this discussion that we're going to be having with Dina Smeltz, senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and Mark Hanna from the Eurasia Group Foundation. Those who have seen or heard me earlier this year have perhaps noted that I've said that I think that the 2020 election in many ways is a foreign policy election, in the sense that the American people, both in the Democratic primary and then in the general election, are being offered real distinct choices in the types of engagement that the U.S. would undertake in the world, questions about our relations with allies and partners, questions of burden sharing, questions of promotion of American values and democracy. And so if that's the case, it's useful to understand, well, what does the American public actually think? What do voters think about what America's role should be in the world? How do they set priorities? What are their risk tolerances for American activity? And then the related question is, will this have an influence on the positions that are taken by candidates, by presidential candidates, by the two parties and their platforms, and by their congressional candidates? I really think we have a wonderful discussion for you today, because we have two people who have been really looking at this issue, and not just doing it from the Washington, D.C. approach of speculating about what people think. And usually what we have is experts in Washington will say what they think, and then take their views and extrapolate from that, that's what the American public wants or desires. But instead, who have been looking at survey data, polling data, focus group data, and really trying to dig down beyond just the bumper stickers of American leadership or America should play a role in the world, to try to really understand where the U.S. voting public is in 2020 on these questions. I'm going to be putting their full biographies in the chat for Dina and for Mark. And also be in the chat, be putting in the links, if you haven't already seen them, to the surveys done by the Eurasia Group Foundation and by the Chicago Council, so that you have those resources available, as well as the work that has been done by the Project on U.S. Global Engagement by the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, so that you will have all of these resources available. But I'll now turn the floor over. Dina, if I can turn to you first to get a sense of what you're finding, what your results are coming up with, anything that has surprised you from the results, and Mark, the same then to you, what you're finding in your research and what you're discovering. And then, of course, both in your initial remarks and also in our discussion, the implications, the so what of all of these questions. Why does it matter? And will it have an actual impact on the election and on policy? So with that, Dina, if I can turn the floor over to you and take us away.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the webinar. Nick and Mark, always great to share a panel with you. Our results have a lot of overlap, as you'll see, and as we present our key findings. But I actually put together just a couple slides. I'm going to share the screen, hope the magic works. Okay. Is everyone seeing the rejecting retreat cover slide? Yeah, okay, cool. So our survey was actually conducted last summer, 2019. A lot has changed since then, obviously. But generally, public opinion on foreign policy tends to be pretty stable. And our surveys, as I'm going to show, most of the figures I'm going to show you are long-term trends, that attitudes remain fairly constant despite shocks like the September 11th attacks and the 2008 financial crisis. But the key takeaways from our survey were that Americans think the United States needs allies and partners to solve global problems. They want shared leadership. They don't want to be the dominant leader. This goes against some of the Trumpian messages of America First. A majority support international engagement in the world. And as the title of the report implicates, that they reject retreat. What retreat means, they reject not taking part in world affairs. It does not mean that they want to be involved militarily in every engagement. They are reluctant to use force generally, and they want to avoid long-term entanglements abroad. But one of the key findings we found over the past couple of years since 2015 is that Americans are growing even more supportive of defending an ally if an ally is threatened, like a NATO ally, like South Korea. They would support sending US troops to help defend them. And this sense of security commitment has risen since 2015, as I said, and it's the most stringent measure of commitment to an ally. So I'm just going to show you a couple key exemplary figures. This is a long-term barometer of international engagement that we've used since '74, but it actually goes all the way back to 1946. And you see there's some ups and downs, but in general, between 6 and 7 in 10 Americans tend to favor taking an active part in world affairs. The most recent 2019, 2018 survey findings for 7 and 10, it's as high as just after the 2001 attacks, the Al-Qaeda attacks on the United States. So people, instead of buying into the withdrawal argument that the administration sometimes makes, they instead have just become even more supportive of taking part in world affairs. When we asked Americans what foreign policy tools make them feel safest, they say, first of all, US military alliances with other countries, and secondarily, maintaining US military superiority. And a few other things, but those are the top things. 8 and 10 also say that the United States should maintain or increase the US commitment to NATO, and 73% say that NATO is essential. That was the highest recorded level since 2002 when we first asked it. Again, maintaining US military superiority, that is not necessarily to say that they want to use their muscle militarily. It's the other results taken together show that Americans see it more as a deterrent rather than actually wanting to get involved in every crisis militarily. Here I had said since 2015 that support for coming to the defense of an ally, like a NATO ally or South Korea, has grown. In 2017, 2018, North Korea was seen as much more of a threat. That's why it was higher then, but it's still a majority. And you can see they've both risen since 2015. And even for if China initiates a military conflict with Japan, and if China invaded Taiwan, it's just minorities, but they have also risen over time in the last couple of years. So the two areas where we might see, and I'm curious to see whether there are changes now from 2019, are on trade and on China. So on trade, I don't know if you guys saw the recent op-ed in the New York Times by Robert Lighthizer, who was saying that the pandemic has revealed an over-reliance on other countries, US over-reliance as a source of critical medicines and medical supplies, and that the public will demand that policymakers remedy this strategic vulnerability. We'll see. I don't know if that's the case, but before that, in 2019, this was one of the surprising findings for me, is that support for international trade had surged even higher than in 2018, which was really high. And this is now among both Republicans and Democrats, large majorities. So it doesn't mean that they agree on the way we should go about trade policy. For example, a majority of Republicans think that tariffs against China are effective, and a majority of Democrats do not. But this is one area that I think could be affected. So we'll see. And the other area that might be affected is China. In 2019, we found differences between Republicans and Democrats on the threat of China. It had risen to 54% among Republicans, but still low. Recent Pew polls have shown that Americans have become more unfavorable, both Republicans and Democrats, 60% now unfavorable toward China, which was an increase. And they also are very critical of China's handling of the coronavirus. They're not full of praise for ours either. Only 47% think our own country did well, but 68% think that, or 64% thought that China was doing a poor job. So China might be an area where we see additional shifts. So that's basically what I wanted to show you in terms of the figures. I think that in today's world, COVID has perhaps highlighted the interdependence of the United States with the rest of the world, and that shows both the risks and the benefits of globalization. We're going to go into the field next month and really explore both sides of that. I think the situation could underscore the necessity of working together on problems that cross borders. And a Pew survey actually showed that 68% found the US should do more to help solve global problems in less developed countries now. So they just asked that question. The pandemic may have broadened individuals' concept of national security in a way that ties what's going on in the world to their own lives and their personal security today, in a way that was very difficult perhaps for policymakers to articulate to them. That's what CAP did a survey and found that was one of their key messaging points that I think the Biden campaign has picked up on to some extent. How do you connect foreign policy to everyday people's lives and make it important to them? This is one very clear way you could do that. At the same time, it could make some people want to close off from the rest of the world, including supporting bans on travel, immigration, and trade. And that's another way that public opinion could go. So that's what we will test this summer. I think I'll stop there.
Nick, did you want me to take over now? Okay. Well, thank you, Dina. That was very illuminating, and I'm a big fan of the Chicago Council's work and the fact that you are sort of a colleague doing this important work. And I just want to take a quick minute to just discuss the importance of surveying public opinion in the first place, because I do think that there is a sort of sense in Washington that we're in this moment where expert opinion is being criticized, and somehow we're placing too much importance on public opinion. And no question that when we're dealing with issues of war and peace and highly complicated and technical foreign policy and national security topics, we don't want to run American foreign policy by referendum, right? We don't want to. We saw what happened with Brexit. We see what happens when there's a sort of a direct democracy approach to what we do in the world. And so, but the Eurasia Group Foundation takes very seriously the importance of engaging with the public on and if it's not simply just explaining the rationale for doing certain things in the world in the name of the American people, it's also relying on the consent of the governed, which is a sort of a prerequisite of democratic politics. So we do think and believe strongly that there has been a way in which official Washington and decision makers have become insulated from public opinion, largely because these topics are so mystified and mystifying. And we do think that there is, Nick, you said at the outset that 2020 might be the foreign policy election. And in some ways, the two candidates are offering different views of of America's role in the world. But on another hand, every time election season rolls around and you ask ordinary Americans what issues they care most deeply about, terrorism might be on the list of the top 10 list, but for the most part, they're pocketbook issues, economics, and things like that. So this isn't to blame, foreign policy establishment for that insulation. There is a way in which political leaders aren't necessarily penalized politically for running afoul of public opinion. But in order to shore up the sort of engagement between the public and policymakers, and to to alleviate some of the mutual suspicion that I think does exist between the two, we wanted to understand what the American public thinks, and in some ways our findings, our data is similar to that of Dina's and the Chicago Council's, even though our interpretation or conclusions might differ. We, like them, found that if, for example, we're a NATO ally to be invaded by Russia, a slight majority, just barely over 50% of Americans would support a military intervention to defend a NATO ally. And we saw that as a sign of a lack of appetite for military interventions. We also noted that a lot of, and I'll also say from the outset here that the Chicago Council's survey is much more sort of broad and ambitious and deals with issues of climate change and economic policy in a way that ours does not. So we are limited on that front, and also goes back 45 years, and has great longitudinal data that, we're a new organization and we've just done this for a couple of years now. But so yes, the title of our survey is "Indispensable No More?" ? And largely one of our main findings when we analyze our data from topic to topic and look at very specific questions of policy, that the American public has very little interest in an approach to the world that resembles the kind of conventional bipartisan wisdom within Washington. So when you're talking about, the war in Afghanistan, the most popular answer option for what do you do with the current situation in Afghanistan is to end our troop presence there. When you talk about American exceptionalism, in the last year alone, support or identification with America as an exceptional country has dipped significantly, while the amount of people who think we are exceptional for what we represent has support for American exceptionalism continues to be driven by sort of understandings of America's example, not so much with its behavior in the world. 35% more of our respondents, and like the Chicago Council, we did a national sample. We conducted ours in, I think, late July, and they did theirs in June. So it's great that we have these data sets because they're sort of synchronized, and we can look across them. But 35% more Americans think that the US should decrease rather than increase its military presence in East Asia as a response to a rising China. And it's almost twice as many Democrats think the United States should decrease its military presence in East Asia and rely on and encourage our allies to become more self-sufficient when providing for their own security needs. More than twice as many Americans want to decrease as increase the defense budget. Still, the most popular answer choice is to maintain it among the broad population. But, and that was about 45% Americans, but the remainder, twice as many, wanted to decrease. There are partisan differences. One thing we did, and I know that the Chicago Council did as well, is to analyze our survey respondents sort of by partisan affiliation. And so immigration remains very much a primary concern of Republicans, while the rise of authoritarianism preoccupies Democrats. But one thing that we noticed in the past year between 2018 and 2019 is that fear of economic damage caused by trade disputes increased across both parties. And I hope we do get a chance to delve into some of the topics here. I think that there are, again, our survey focused much more on specific issues where the possibility of military intervention exists. So NATO alliances, the threat of a nuclear Iran, China's rise, Afghanistan. And it's interesting because I think I draw on some of the data in the Chicago Council survey when I'm sort of trying to validate some of our own findings. And again, the Chicago Council has a finding that 27% say military intervention actually contributes to U.S. safety. So I think there is a sense, while the title is, rejecting retreat, that our military interventions, retreat in the literal sense, is not well loved or tolerated by the American public. But I hope that's a discussion we can get into. One other thing I want to just kind of put in there as an asterisk is, there seems to be this kind of bipartisan consensus in Washington around what America's foreign policy interests are and national interests are. That's not always shared by the public. And in fact, we asked our survey respondents about which country presents the biggest threat to peace in the Middle East. And Republicans were about 13% more likely than Democrats to choose Iran. And Democrats were about 10% more likely than Republicans to choose Saudi Arabia. So when we're looking at these kind of two main power players in that region, Iran was still the top vote getter for, whether you're independent, Democrat, Republican, but that we're starting to see differences through a partisan lens among voters. And I think that has, to bring it back to your point, Nick, about wanting to discuss this in the context of the 2020 campaign, that has implications for who's trying to get which votes in 2020. The kind of China bashing that we're seeing, and this talk of a new Cold War with China, this is a perennial topic we see every 4 years. There's no political disincentive to throw shade on China. It's not a big voting bloc within the US. It's not a big domestic constituency. It's not to suggest that any of this criticism of China is insincere, but we've seen, when it was Barack Obama and Mitt Romney was scolding China about currency manipulation, and Barack Obama was talking tough on human rights. We see this every 4 years. And then when it comes time to governing, I think the American president, has harder compromises to make. But one thing we also see every 4 years is that typically the winner of the contest for president runs on a campaign of doing less in the world. And we saw this with George W. Bush, who wanted to stop nation building. We saw this with Barack Obama as well, who wanted to do nation building at home. We saw this with Donald Trump. And then when these guys, and so far it's been guys, get into the White House, that the imperatives of governing change, and there is a way in which there is a kind of difficulty in finding even foreign policy and national security talent that shares that particular worldview in Washington. And for a number of reasons, that changes. But this is to suggest that doing less in the world and the downsides of overextension are visible to the public, and there's a political reason why I think people succeed politically when they make the case to end endless wars, when they make the case to spend less on the military relative even while maintaining military superiority and reprioritizing domestic issues. So, so I hope we can, talk about the political implications of it. Like we like the Chicago Council are a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization, so we don't give advice to any of the campaigns, but certainly our surveys have implications for the 2020 election.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Mark. This was really great to give us a platform for taking the rest of the time and to discuss. I just wanted to kind of complete the opening half hour with a few points connecting to remarks that you both made with what we're finding from the Carnegie Council side, and again some of these issues. This point about foreign policy and domestic policy, which is that Americans will rank these domestic policy issues, but increasingly, whether it's climate change, jobs, the economy, they have foreign policy dimensions. And I think we still do not always see both the American public, but also the campaigns making those connections as clear as they might be, that if you're going to pursue a particular strategy with regard to climate change, that has there's a foreign policy attached to it. And I was very struck by the reporting that Peter Beinart did earlier this month that these unity commissions between the Biden and Sanders campaigns to really hash out how a Democratic Party platform will be created almost completely ignore foreign policy, that there appears to be no appetite for, it's all focusing on domestic issues, but also leaving that question of the foreign policy implications of the domestic agenda that you're proposing as if these are two separate realms. And I think that will be interesting to see. From our survey results, which are not as broad as both of yours, and also skew towards the people who've responded to them. A couple points I just wanted to bring out, that most people have a sense that the world is getting more dangerous, not safer. This was done prior to the pandemic, but 8 in 10 said that they were expecting a major cataclysm of some sort, whether environmental or economic, to strike relatively soon. Maybe some people had a sense of foreboding already developing around COVID-19. People were very split on this question of whether the default setting in world affairs now is one of competition or confrontation versus cooperation. Really with almost kind of not quite a third and a third and a third, but really kind of a 40-40 split on we are in a competitive world, we're in a cooperative world, with the remainder really falling to no, this is a confrontational world. And that has implications for what we've seen with the pandemic. Do you work with other countries to promote a common response? Do you safeguard or hold in things like vaccines because you want them for yourself and you feel that you don't want to give advantages to others? So how that plays out will be interesting. 2 points that I wanted to throw in as well, which is the question of trade-offs. When we've asked people about where the trade-offs should be on certain issues, we found responses all over the proverbial map. When do domestic issues take priority over foreign policy? When should foreign policy commitments take precedence over domestic issues? We found no agreement. One of the more specific questions we asked, which was if disengagement from Afghanistan results in a settlement that sets back women's rights in Afghanistan, which do you take? Will you take disengagement from Afghanistan and end to the military operation, or will you stay to try to continue to promote women's rights, gender equality? And there we found a split, often but not completely informed by the gender of the respondent, that to some extent men were more willing to accept a peace deal in Afghanistan with less concern for how that might play out for women's rights, and women respondents, not surprisingly, were a little less eager to write off the fate of Afghan women. But again, these kinds of how do you do the trade-offs And then finally, I mean, I think this ties, Mark, to your last point about how this will play out. And then I'll finish here, and I will, if you have any, Dina or Mark, anything you wanted to respond to each other, and we are collecting questions right now as well. So then I'll be quiet and let the questions come out to you. One of the things we asked at the end of our survey, which was, will you vote for a candidate who's, if you disagree with if you agree with their domestic policy, but you disagree with their foreign policy stance, will you vote for that candidate, either for a presidential candidate or a congressional candidate? And what I was struck by was 2/3 of the respondents either said that they would vote for a candidate, even if they disagreed with their foreign policy stance, or they weren't sure. Only 1/3 of the respondents said, if I disagree with a presidential or congressional candidate on foreign policy, will I withhold my vote or cast for another? And I think, Mark, that goes to your point about political figures, politicians, and political appointees in Washington know that there is a much greater grace period or grace that's extended to them on foreign policy issues should they go against the popular will than on domestic issues. So with that, let me turn it back over. Mark, Dean, if there's anything you wanted to respond to each other, and then Alex Woodson will be presenting the questions as they come in.
Dina? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Dina, you're still muted.
Right.
Oh, there you are. All right.
The dog stopped barking, so I just wanted to go back to the China dimension, which I think will be a big issue. And I think what's a little bit different now is that it's just become much more clear that there is the two campaigns are trying to out-hawk each other now on China in a way that during the primaries, it was to some extent that was there, but now it's even more. And not only because coronavirus has made some Americans critical of China, perhaps they blame China, some of them, for the outbreak. It's also what's going on in Hong Kong and Taiwan and everything coming together in a perfect storm that China might rise as more of an issue of resonance to both parties at this point. And then I too, Nick, was taken by Peter Boehnhardt's article. I thought that was really interesting because I think it highlighted that Joe Biden's probably natural impulse is to be a restorationist. I think Tom Wright wrote about this too, that basically he would want to, he's focusing on undoing a lot of what Trump is doing and reaffirming the value of alliances and trying to restore the US image in the world. But that because he's also focused on getting the Biden supporters, the Sanders supporters to come into the Biden camp, and because of the coronavirus issue highlighting domestic needs, that foreign policy really hasn't become much of a talking point for the campaign. And I, like you, do think that foreign policy is one way that Democrats can really stand out now, and in a more simple way than perhaps in the past, that to contrast just the way the United States works with other countries, we should be positive toward allies, not treat them disrespectfully and embrace dictators like Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin while at the same time dissing our allies. So I think just the American public's image of who a commander-in-chief should be for this country and what kind of person they would want, it seems like perhaps a case could be made that foreign policy really affects the way people around the world view the country and want to interact with it, invest in it. So it seems like that could be the case, but foreign policy generally is not the top reason people vote. So tying it to other issues, especially those issues that have an international and domestic component, like immigration, like climate change, like jobs, and the economy, would probably be a good idea.
Yeah, and I think to Dina's point, I mean, she mentioned, foreign policy is the way we're typically viewed in the world, and that's actually the subject of another survey that we at the Eurasia Group Foundation did just a couple more recently. We surveyed 10 countries and their foreign publics to see what are the main drivers of their support or opposition to American-style democracy, to the U.S. in general, the favorability of the U.S. And one thing that we realized, we ran a regression and found that if you resent American foreign policy, you're a lot more likely to have an unfavorable view of the U.S. than, other things that you might than if you had, other things about the American government or the U.S. That you dislike. So that is a big driver of our perception overseas. And I do think, yes, just also tapping in on the Beinhart piece and the way in which, to your point, Nick, that people might vote for a candidate even if they dislike their foreign policy because it might not affect their daily lives in a way that other issues might. I do think the way that this could become a foreign policy election is when Americans realize that we're in this moment of an imperial presidency, and the executive has a lot more leeway and a lot more latitude in doing certain things in the world than they do domestically. Domestically, they're restrained in ways that they aren't necessarily overseas. And so if people want a more stable or more predictable or a more, belligerent or restrained foreign policy, they might pick the candidate that fits that image and that vision. And it might have more sway this time around.
All right, Alex, if you've been, I see things are coming through on the chat. If you wanted to go ahead and give questions to our panelists, and we'll take it from there. And also, we're seeing things come through on the chat, and I'm also engaging on the chat as well. So we'll keep forward at both levels of verbal and chat.
Thanks, Nick. We'll go to question from Nancy Stafford. Dina, you touched on this a little bit. With the current China bashing, how do you feel the situation in Hong Kong might affect the 2020 election? It would be uncharacteristic of the president to take on a rule of law issue, but he has been talking tough.
Yeah, I touched on it. I think it will affect people's opinions about China. But I think with both, the candidates have less daylight between them in terms of dealing with Hong Kong and human rights issues. So I'm not sure how much it would affect their opinions of China. I don't know if it would make somebody switch from one candidate to another, at least at this point. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, no, that's my read of it too. There was some sort of cryptic language that Donald Trump uttered, I think yesterday, when he was asked whether he would put sanctions on China in response to crackdowns on these most recent protests. I think he said something like, "We're going to do something very powerfully, and you'll be surprised." And it's difficult. I think both candidates are. There's a tendency to want to talk tough on China with respect to Hong Kong, and for all the kind of commentary about how we're going to stand up with Hong Kongers, there's very little specificity in what the policy could or would be, and I don't think that there is that much difference. I think if there's any kind of and how each responds to China. So I do think that I do think neither one. I think you said it perfectly. I think Dina said it. Maybe Nick. That they're trying to out-hawk each other, and I think that the political imperative right now for both candidates is not to seem somehow weaker on China. So yes, whereas Donald Trump might be reticent around issues of law and order with powerful and sort of strongman leaders like President Xi, he might ratchet up his rhetoric just not to be outdone by Joe Biden.
Thank you. And I just saw on the chat from Nancy Stafford coming in that the State Department has just declared that Hong Kong is no longer considered autonomous. So I think that we're revising our position
Economic.
on
Yeah, I
that.
mean that is going to be a huge detriment not only to Hong Kong but to the PRC and to the CCP, because that that is a cash cow for them, and I think that is while they're focused on unity, they also want Hong Kong to maintain its affluence. And I will say though, getting back to our survey results, we sacrificed some concision for precision, and so we primed our survey respondents by saying, China is getting more powerful, its geopolitical influence is increasing. What do you think the U.S. should do specifically? And we offered U.S. should reduce its military presence while transitioning regional allies toward defending themselves and taking over responsibility for security. And then others were, the other option was the U.S. should move more troops onto U.S. bases in allied countries such as South Korea and Japan to increase its naval presence in the Pacific Ocean as well. So about 60% wanted to reduce our presence, only 40% wanted to increase our presence. And that was more pronounced among independents and Democrats wanting to reduce our presence. I did notice also in the Chicago Council survey, the perception of China as a quote unquote critical threat in the past year, and at least 2019, was pretty much on par with what it's been throughout the past 20 years,
Right.
and a lot less than it was in 1998, 2002. So maybe that's going to go up this year as a result of this rhetorical escalation. I'd be curious to know what Dina thought or anticipated for the next.
Yeah, I think we need, thanks Mark for teeing that up. I think we need some more questions. So China is not considered a great military threat by Americans, but they're doing it through the lens of a military threat to the United States. If we asked a military threat to its leaders or in the region, that might be something different. Again, whether they feel like that is of vital interest to them, Americans, is then another question. So I think we need to dig a little deeper. Certainly human rights issues are important, but not as important as a lot of other issues, at least in terms of ranking our surveys. They think preventing terrorism, right now, combating infectious diseases like coronavirus is a very high threat for them. And defending and promoting human rights around the world is important, but it's not sort of at the top of their agenda. So we will need to ask some specific questions, I think, about Hong Kong in particular, and ask about, is China a threat in various parts of the world, and whether the United States should do anything about it. Americans are very open to taking diplomatic sanctions against a country and economic sanctions against a country. They're very supportive of exhausting all those. It's when more difficult matters come. And also, we'd have to put trade-offs in if there are economic sanctions. Would that do something with our trade? We know that tariffs were hurting certain people more than others. So there's a lot of dimensions to it. And I think, yeah, we need to do more. In general, Americans are more supportive of cooperating with China than trying to contain China or contain its influence. So given the past year, it should be a really interesting issue for us to look at.
Okay, I'll go to another question. This is from Jonathan Gage. Question is, did any of your polls or surveys indicate that many Americans are concerned with the US abdication of its international leadership role, or with the widespread foreign perception that American leadership is in steep decline?
Our polling shows that in general, Americans still think we're the most influential country in the world. They don't see our influence declining now, but they do in the future. They see China's influence rising. So a lot of it comes down to partisanship, that, Republicans think this administration is doing a good job on all fronts, and not all fronts, but for the most part, Republicans tend to be supportive of the policies of this administration and think the United States is doing very well, and while Democrats are the opposite and are not satisfied. So I think this is a very partisan view right now. The partisan preference is a super important and strong factor in how people view the United States right now. But that in general, people still think of our influence as being pretty intact.
I'll say, and I don't have a specific question to whether Americans are upset about, quote unquote, abdication of global leadership, but I will say one thing we did look at empirically is whether people think we're an exceptional country and why or not. And the amount of respondents who think we're not an exceptional country, but simply that every country has attributes which distinguish it and ultimately acts rather in its own interests, went up from basically a third to 2/5 between 2018 and 2019. And this rise was most pronounced among younger American. It was the top answer choice for respondents under 45 years old. So and 55% of people between 18 and 29 think the US is not an exceptional country. Now, how much of that is related to a sort of pessimism connected to the current administration, or how much of that is just young people not living through the heady successes of, the Cold War, is an open question.
I think it's the latter, actually. So we have a question too that we've asked several years now about, is the United States the greatest country in the world, or is it no greater than other countries? And it's been going down. It's first time we asked it, I can't remember what year, maybe 2014. It was like 70%, now it's 60%. Younger Americans have consistently been least likely to say this is the greatest country. And I think part of that is just growing up in globalization too. You know a lot more about other countries as well, and perhaps.
Well, come on. It was also the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and these unsuccessful.
That's part of it too. But also, I think, like my generation, we were socialized in school to have this patriotic feeling about, we're so lucky to be born in this country, the freest country on earth. And I don't know that that is the same way younger generations are socialized.
So bring back civics education, right? Partly.
That would be.
I'm serious.
That might help, but and I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I don't, knowing that there are other great nations on earth, and for different reasons, different countries are better at some things than others. I think that's healthy, but nevertheless, so we do have that same finding in our data.
Okay,
I saw a question about climate change, actually, and I wanted to jump on that because that's one of my favorite items. Yeah. So
can I just ask it just so everyone?
Yes.
I'm not sure everyone can see the question. So
sure.
It's a really good question. Glad we're getting to it. So this is from Trina Thorbjornsen. The question is: does framing the climate crisis as a national security emergency significantly change voter attitudes when deciding whether they support a presidential candidate's foreign policy? I'm curious to see what the polling shows when intersecting climate and foreign policy.
So I'm sure if you frame any issue and with certain wording, it will have an impact on people's views. So framing it, saying that it's a crisis, and then asking people how they feel about it will impact their views. But we asked about a series of threats, and if I can find, we asked about a series of threats, and climate change was one of maybe 15 threats, and it comes about the middle in our survey last year, but it was the first time a majority said that climate change was a critical threat to the United States, 54%. It's been inching upward, but that was really great. It's especially high among Democrats. It's especially high among younger Americans. Pew also asked the question just a few months ago, and they also found 60% rated climate change threat, which is again below things like Iran's nuclear threat, North Korea's nuclear threat, terrorism, coronavirus and diseases like that, nuclear proliferation. Those are often and always in the top 5, but climate change is a growing threat. And again, especially among Democrats and younger people.
Okay, unless Mark, you want to add to that, I can go to another question.
I'll just quickly chime in and say that I think that the one thing that the coronavirus has done is to demonstrate how the biggest threats to American national security are not national threats. And the pandemic is an example of that, as is climate change. And so I think that the way in which global cooperation, international cooperation is required in order to combat some of the more if not existential, the most dire threats to human lives and prosperity in the United States. I think that's been brought into stark relief in the past couple months.
I think climate change is also an interesting issue, politically speaking, because a lot of the several Republican political campaign strategists, like Frank Luntz, for example, now is embracing climate change as a key issue for younger voters and for the Republican Party to be able to grow their base among this new generation, that they should start addressing the issue. And also there's economic implications that they can build a green economy around and make that a talking point. So it's interesting. We saw a tiny shift among the Republican electorate toward thinking climate change is a threat, but in certain states, there are key individuals among the Republican Party who are also really looking at that as an issue for the future.
Dina and Mark, just if I can, just given some of the discussions that are happening on the chat simultaneously, I think that what you've just in your last answer, if I can maybe ask you and Mark, the sense that demographic change in the United States, generational change in the United States, what impact does this have then on foreign policy? Because and I'm not doing justice to the many questions that are coming through that I don't think we're going to be able to get to immediately. But there is a sense that a younger, more diverse group of politicians may have a different set of foreign policy priorities. On the other hand, when I read Stacey Abrams' piece in Foreign Affairs, what really struck me was how conventional it was. That people will say, we have to have new constituencies represented in the U.S., and then somehow people go into a box and they come out as committed Cold Warrior transatlanticists, saying the same thing that would have been said 30 years ago. So, any sense that you're getting from the polling data or anything else that should we expect that millennials, Gen Z, as they start to move upward in politics, will it lead to changes in how we conceive of foreign policy and national security?
Okay, sure. Well, a couple things. So your last point, Nick, reminded me that two things. People after the 2016 election were really interested in views of the Midwestern public, because we, especially us being in Chicago, said, well, what happened in the Midwest with the election? Midwesterners must really want to put their head in the sand and not deal with the outside world. And we did a booster sample, which is just like an expanded sample in the Midwest that we could then compare with more confidence to the other parts of it. And we really found very little, a little bit of difference on trade, that Midwesterners were more concerned about the tariffs against China having an impact on them in the Midwest, which was a bit prescient. But other than that, there weren't really very many differences. And then the same thing, we did another study years prior and looked at Latino Americans and did another expanded sample of them and found that among Hispanic Americans, really, they held the same foreign policy as all other Americans, except they had a greater confidence. They had greater confidence in the United Nations and seemed more familiar with the United Nations, and were more concerned about climate change than the average American at that time. So there are some just key constants across Americans that want to work with other countries in the world, and that they want to be engaged in the world. There are demographic trends that would suggest that perhaps more democratic leaders would be favored if the current trends continue, just that people who are non-white and younger tend to be more liberal than older and white Americans. And the younger people tend, and Democrats too, actually, are less concerned, or they emphasize less America's projection of its strength and influence in a military way around the world. So that includes defense spending. It also includes getting involved militarily in entanglements abroad. They support peacekeeping. And it doesn't mean they don't support coming to the aid of allies if they're threatened, but in general, they're especially younger Americans right now are less supportive of military interventions. Now, part of that could be just the life cycle they're in, because we do see a trend toward being more accepting of that as people age. But there is something, at least in the last surveys we did among the millennial generation, that they are a bit lower in terms of tolerating military interventions. So we'll see, but those would be the main things in terms of foreign policy. No, I don't think there are any great cracks in whether we should follow a multilateral type of approach compared to today.
I do think I agree with Dina, and anybody who hasn't checked out their study, the Chicago Council study on intergenerational differences, is I highly commend it to them. It's a really wonderful and insightful study on the way in which, to the conversation earlier, the younger generation, which hasn't lived through, the Cold War success, let alone World War II and the Greatest Generation victories, is a lot less bullish about intervention. And one thing that we found from our study that kind of corresponds with this is that we proposed a scenario where humanitarian intervention or military intervention when in the case of human rights abuses. And we were surprised to know that the youngest generation, people 18 to 29, were most likely to, more likely than any other age group, to effectively abstain from intervention in the case of human rights abuses. So, this is a generation that is seen as somehow sort of invincible, right? Young people we think of as invincible and empathetic toward foreign populations. And this is the group that effectively didn't want to, that wanted to focus on human rights problems at home, or such as mass incarceration and aggressive policing, rather than going abroad. It wanted to focus on other things. So, and the only group that wanted or that supported intervention over non-intervention was 60 years old and over. So I think we are seeing a way in which the younger generation is coming up with a different set of lived experiences than the older generation, and that's shaping their policy preferences. It's also happening in the economic sphere, right? They're not anticipating being economically better off than their parents. And so there's a lot of talk and scholarly discussion about how they're down on free market economics compared to other generations. So I think that there is a way in which experience informs preference, and we're seeing that in the foreign policy sphere, no doubt.
It's interesting that the fault line, everyone looks at the millennial generation as that's the generation that has broken with the trends. But it's actually in our data consistently the 45 and over that are different from all the younger generations. And I think that's the Cold War experience and experiencing military interventions that we may see as having been successful, where Afghanistan, Iraq are not necessarily seen as being successful in their missions. So I think that might have a big influence on whether you think these interventions are worth it or not, and also how long they have been in play.
That's a great point. We are at the top of the hour, and so we are going to close this discussion. I want to thank everyone for their contribution, certainly to Mark and to Dina, to all of our participants. We have tried to put onto the chat as many links to things you've heard referenced today, articles, reports, studies, so that you can continue to look at these things. This will be posted to YouTube as well, so certainly feel free to circulate to people who weren't able to attend and to continue the conversation there. And certainly also take the opportunity to see what future events will be and studies and reports, both from the Carnegie Council, but also the Chicago Council and the Eurasia Group Foundation, so that we can continue these conversations in future settings. And again, thank you to my guests and panelists on this. And with that, we'll call this meeting to a close.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Dina.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to see you.
Likewise.